our biggest and most lethal enemy, Hezbollah in the north, today faces strategic, I would almost say existential threats in the face of Lebanese legislation to actually disarm that foreign terrorist organization, which is what Hezbollah is in Lebanon, from its weapons. What Israel is doing is still applying pressure in order for Hamas to say, okay, we're willing to hand over the hostages, all of them, 48 murdered and live ones, and we agreed to surrender.
Well, let's turn to the military front line now as we approach 2 full years since the beginning of the October 7th war. Joining me now is our friend, a military expert. He's the former international spokesperson of the IDF and a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus. Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Good to have you with us. And I look back, our first show that we did, our first briefing was on October the 8th. We've now reached past the 700 days mark. We're about to reach the 2-year mark. What are your thoughts on everything that's transpired since then?
My initial thought is that I'm saddened that it's taken us so long. On one hand, I'm very happy with many of the military achievements, and there's a long list of military achievements that our security forces have been able to achieve for the State of Israel. Perhaps most importantly is that our biggest and most lethal enemy, Hezbollah in the north, today faces strategic, I would almost say existential threats in the face of Lebanese legislation to actually disarm that foreign terrorist organization, which is what Hezbollah is in Lebanon, from its weapons. And that's the first time in Lebanese history. If that happens with American support and advice behind the scenes, that will be a regional game changer. And if that is the only positive result of October 7, that's a major significant improvement for Israel. I am happy with the situation in Syria, and I think there's slight room for optimism and perhaps something of a pragmatic situation to emerge from it. I'm very happy that for the first time, our nemesis and main enemy, the main disrupting country and state sponsor of terrorism in the world and the Middle East, which spent billions of dollars, 20 years on trying to encircle Israel in that ring of fire. Of course, I'm referring to the Islamic Republic of Iran. For the first time in their history, they've been right-sized, they feel vulnerable, they've been exposed, and they know that this isn't the end of the new chapter in the book called Israel and the Islamic Republic of Iran. So those are good things. I am very sad that we still have 48 Israeli hostages in enemy captivity. Not a day goes by that I don't think about them. I just finished reading Eli Sharabi's book, and I've heard many testimonies of hostages, and it defies belief that our people are held by an enemy not so far away, and that we still haven't found neither the military nor the diplomatic means to get them out. And we should do that, of course, with defeating that enemy, Hamas. But 2 years after, I think what Israel has done is defied a lot of conventional wisdom. A lot of experts and a lot of people who told Israel on the 7th and 8th and 9th and 15th, and then for the most of the two years that have followed, that you can't do this and you can't do that and you mustn't do this and we forbid you to do that, whether it was going into Gaza City first, and then Khan Yunis, and then Rafah, and then Lebanon, and Syria, and Damascus, and all of the other things that Israel has done, and we can add Doha to that list. We've been told what we cannot do and what we mustn't do, and we've been told that we wouldn't be able to last as a country, as a military, as an economy in 2 years of war. And Israel, through its tremendous security forces, through its youth, and despite mistakes made, I think, by leadership at elsewhere, but at the end of the day, decisions and execution has allowed Israel to basically defy most. And last, I would say, also very important, is that I think we have to recognize that had it not been for the election of President Trump, I think we would have been sitting in a different situation. I think international pressure, that tremendous tsunami of boycotts and defamations and attacks against Israel at the very existence, the very basic existence of Israel, I think that they would have been much more effective and painful for Israel had it not been for the fact that President Trump was elected And he and his administration have been driving a very, very clear policy of standing with Israel and allowing Israel to fight in order to defend itself. And that's tremendously important. We mustn't underestimate the importance of it.
And of course, we remember the enormity, the awfulness of October the 7th. But looking ahead 2 years, would you then conclude that Israel is in a safer place now?
I think militarily speaking, yes, we are in a safer place. My concern is mostly where we are diplomatically and our international standing. I think that is where Israel absolutely, urgently needs to shift in terms of budgets, priorities, attention of our senior elected officials, and the bureaucracy of the military, the defense, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Everything needs to shift and to understand that this is the main battlefield. It's a battlefield where many times we are absentees. We are not really fighting the state of Israel. There are organizations like Stand With Us who speak on behalf of the Jewish people, but that isn't something that can replace diplomacy and really the priorities of a country, of a nation state. And that needs to change, and it needs to have changed decades ago, but very urgently now. And I think that is where we will see the battlefield migrate to. I think Israelis, whether it's civilians, companies, institutions, universities, everything, we all feel how many parts of the Western world are encroaching and trying to tighten the noose, economic, social, cultural, around the neck of Israelis. And that is what the state of Israel needs to fight, needs to do it with the same level of creativity and finesse and daring as Mossad did in Iran and as the IDF operated in Lebanon, and with the same level of consistency and stamina that we are fighting Hamas in Gaza. Keeping our eyes on the objective and understanding what needs to be done, and then doing what needs to be done. And that means a totally different posture in terms of how much money we spend on our diplomacy, who is head of our public affairs and public diplomacy, and really thinking about it totally differently. That is perhaps the most important policy change that I believe needs to happen, because on a military level, we are in a far better situation now than we were 2 years ago. And again, I'll say perhaps a word of caution and humility. On October 7, as horrible as it was, we did in fact get lucky. Our biggest and most dangerous enemy, Hezbollah, for reasons that we will not know, that Hassan Nasrallah took with him to his grave, and when he went to hell, that went with him. We won't know why they decided not to join in Hamas's attack on October 7. I, having good insight into Hezbollah's plans, know that it would have been a very, very different situation. And that was prevented, which we should be very thankful for. But militarily speaking, yes, better situation, diplomatically, politically, and in terms of international standing, needs to change, and not a moment too soon.
Let's go to the front line. Tell us what's happening right now in Gaza City.
Right, so we have 4 IDF division combat teams. Now, numbers-wise, because maybe people don't, okay, what's a division combat team? So essentially that's around 10,000 soldiers, everybody included, combatants, non-combatants, but that's roughly it. So we have 3 division combat teams operating in and around Gaza City, and we have 1 division combat team holding the ground and doing offensive operations in the southern part of the Gaza City, Khan Yunis, and to a certain extent Rafah. So total of 4 operating now. At this day, what Israel is doing is still applying pressure. I read everything happening on the ground still as applying military pressure in order for Hamas to say, okay, we get it, we give up, we're willing to hand over the hostages, all of them, 48 murdered and live ones, and we agreed to surrender, and we understand that we are not going to govern the Gaza Strip at the end of this war. That's what Israel is looking for, and Israel is applying, squeezing, to put it plainly, squeezing and applying military force from the air on the ground, trying to get civilians out of Gaza City, and that has 2 purposes. One is to keep them relatively safe so that they won't be used by Hamas as human shields on the ground, which Hamas unfortunately has done exceedingly well throughout this war. And the second is to apply pressure on Hamas, because discomfort for the civilian population means pressure on Hamas. It keeps them safe, the civilian population, in the Moassi humanitarian area, but it also signals to the Hamas leadership that, well, these people, Palestinians, are paying the price of Hamas's refusal to end the war. And where I think, sadly, we're coming up short is that the messaging and the framing of this is the world doesn't get that this is what it's about, that if Hamas handed over the hostages, agreed to the American proposal, President Trump's and the Witkoff team have proposed this, to end the war, hand over the hostages and surrender, the war ends quickly, like instantly. Within a matter of a few days, the war's over, and we and others can start to avail ourselves of, okay, how do we change the trajectory of the Gaza Strip, and how do we now get it rebuilt? Education, mosques, and many other things that really fundamentally need to change, but sadly, that isn't where most of the world is. There's significant combat, obviously, and sadly, because Israel, out of a concern of not hitting non-combatant civilians, so Israel has telegraphed its intentions ahead of time and basically told the enemy, this is where we're going to be coming, and even indicated where we're going to be coming from along the coastal route and then from the southeast, and everybody...
No element of surprise.
No, so we don't have that. An element of surprise is very, very important, and the lay of the land, what Hamas has been able to do is to prepare themselves extremely well, above and below ground, with lots of IEDs, defensive fortifications. They know we're coming, and now we're coming. So what we're seeing is slow advance of Israeli forces with massive air support and artillery support. I think that Israel, the IDF, is now implementing lessons that should have been implemented long ago, which is get civilians out and then first use fire, then have Israeli soldiers on the ground, armored and infantry and engineers advance, and minimize to the greatest extent possible the chances of Israeli soldiers getting wounded. Now, where does it get really complicated? The IDF, the Shabak, they understand that a core moral obligation is to do everything possible to get the hostages out, including, of course, putting soldiers at risk in order to find intel or perhaps to try to extract them physically. That is going to be very dangerous for everybody involved, but I think that the IDF will try to do that as safely as possible. I think it's an almost impossible tactical situation because we know from testimonies of hostages how Hamas terrorists keep our hostages in dungeons with terrorists that have one job in case of any threat, and that is to execute hostages if Israel tries to breach in. So hopefully Israel will be able to be creative and use different methods in order to achieve that very important objective. I think we have an excellent chief of staff, we have excellent commanders, we have a strong, very hard military that understands that this is a battle where stamina is key and that keeping our eyes on the objective is very important. In 1948, when things got tough in the War of Independence, and when some parts of the IDF came close to breaking, I remember a book written by a former Israeli commander who said, well, when it rains on everybody. When it's tough, it gets tough for everybody. It's tough for Hamas, it's tough for Israel. Now we will see who is tougher and who has most belief in their cause and what they need to do. And I believe that is Israel. And I believe that we are very, very justified in doing so. And I also believe that if we don't, we will regret it for a long time.
Let's move to that dramatic attack on Doha, Qatar, that pinpoint attack on the Hamas leaders meeting there. What can you tell us about that?
Well, looks like we didn't meet our own goals, and sadly we didn't get the terrorists that we wanted to, which is regrettable. I think the diplomatic and strategic situation would have been different, and the fallout of the strike would have been different had we had a beautiful display of 7 or 8 Hamas coffins with all of the arch-terrorists eliminated. Sadly, that wasn't achieved, and I think there's lots of lessons to be identified and implemented specifically for politicians when ordering such a strike, because if you order such a strike in a sovereign country and you limit the use of force, or you limit the munitions that you use in order to minimize fallout and collateral damage, but you don't get the job done, then it's worth considering whether or not it's worth doing it to begin with. But there's a lot of other things to learn. I think the positives are that terrorists and the state sponsors of terrorism have now understood that they're on notice. And I think that's very important. It's important about Egypt. It's important about Turkey. It's very important about Qatar. I very much enjoyed seeing the charade of lies and communications from the Qataris spoken in American media and elsewhere about who knew, who authorized, and how this happened. And let's be abundantly clear, this will be a bit hurtful for the Qataris, but
They're big fans of this show.
Yeah, I'm sure they are. I'm sure they watch and like everything that Stand With Us does. I think it's technically impossible for Israel, the IDF, Israeli Air Force, to conduct any meaningful activity anywhere near Qatari airspace without not only American knowledge, prior knowledge of it, but approval and coordination. Now that's reality. And then we could spin lots of things around it, and we can have statements by politicians and many other things. That's the tachlis reality. Now you can take that tachlis reality, and if you're a Qatari, you would be wise and say, okay, I've just gotten a very blunt message here from the American president that your credit line has a certain stop to it, and you got very close to getting to the stop of that credit line. You kind of maxed out. And I think that's a very important, perhaps the only positive diplomatic issue here is that the Qataris have been perhaps handed and forced to eat a good slice of humble pie. I think it's also important to see that there was a lot of talk, Muslim and Arab talk in the convention the summit that they organized the week after, but I'm happy to see that there was a lot of talk with very little substance. And I wouldn't want to see an Arab NATO. I doubt its ability to come into to reality, but I wouldn't like to see one, and I think it would be very, very problematic from an international point of view if Egypt were to head such a hostile alliance against Israel. After all, it's a country that allegedly or is still signatory to 1979 peace treaty with Israel. On the ground, they're behaving anything unlike it. Almost everything that Egypt does is very much not what you would expect from a country that has a peace treaty with another.
Is that from the fear that Gazans are going to enter Egypt? They have, from the outset, been adamant that no Gazans should get into their country. They've held that border down there at the south of Gaza. Is that where it's coming from?
I think it's coming from the basic Egyptian desire and strategy to keep Israel busy with the Palestinians and to have Israel tied down in an almost endless war. I think Gazan blood is on Egyptian hands. The Egyptians, the Arab Republic of Egypt, should have opened the doors, opened the gate at Rafah and allowed people out. That would have shortened the war significantly. It would have saved tens of thousands of non-combatants, and it would have prevented a lot of the destruction and a lot of the suffering that Palestinians are enduring. They haven't done so because their strategic interest, I believe, is to keep this conflict ongoing. From their point of view, it's great. They get a seat at the international table of the big boys. They get recognition. They get attention from the US. They are, again, important for the world. They had very big issues of importance before that, but now they have a seat at the table at our expense. And what it does, it also, at the bigger picture, it keeps Israel busy constantly with the Palestinian conflict. And from an Arab perspective, and I know that people will dispute this, but I believe that from an Arab perspective, Palestinians are very little more than a tool against Israel. And I think the level of cynicism that Egyptian and Jordanians make decisions with regards to Palestinians is unprecedented, so tremendously cruel. Instead of really helping those poor people in Gaza, poor or not we can debate, but okay, they elected Hamas and then they've been supporting Hamas for the last 17, 18 years, so we can perhaps, they're not that poor and innocent, but we'll put that aside. But if you're an Egyptian and you really care about your Muslim brother, then help him. Helping isn't locking them in and preventing them to flee and leaving them at the mercy of Hamas and facing the consequences of Hamas's war against Israel. That is cynical beyond belief, and I think that the only reason they're doing it is because if Gazans would be able to get out, Israel would win the war swiftly, Hamas would be defeated. I don't think that there's any high risk of Palestinians destabilizing Egyptian society if they're in a properly maintained and serviced refugee center in Sinai, hundreds of kilometers from Cairo. That doesn't influence the delicate balance of demography in Egypt. It would only be a good thing because they would get money and support, and we would perhaps stabilize the situation. But at the end of the day, that isn't what Egypt wants. From their point of view, this is really the gift that keeps on giving. And it's a very sad and cynical situation. Humans suffering, civilians are suffering. And I regret that Egypt isn't forced to pay any diplomatic or military price for it.
Let's turn to Syria for a moment. We saw Assad being taken down by al-Shara. Assad obviously had support from Iran. So what's happening here? Because we're being told to expect a potential peace agreement between Syria and Israel. Is this a matter of my enemy's enemy is my friend?
So what's happening in Syria is that Syria has really changed trajectory as a result of the successful takeover sponsored by Turkey, which is not important, and we'll get to it in a second. But Syria has changed trajectory, and now it's basically up for, not for grabs, but for influence. And what the US is doing is saying, well, here's the carrot. We can give you, delete sanctions that have been in place against the Syrian regime for a long time, and that will be a tremendous positive influence for Syria. And we can bring you back to amongst the nations of the world. And what we, the Americans, can also do is stabilize the security situation with Israel. I think that from a Syrian perspective, what they're really looking at is mostly foreign investment and, again, being accommodated back into the world. And Israel is a sideshow to that bigger picture. Now, very importantly, with Syria, Syria had various hostile roles against Israel. The most important one was that they were a stepping stone and a launch pad for the Iranians against Israel. The Iranians used Syria as if they owned it, and they did some horrible atrocities there against different minorities, specifically against Sunnis. I'm sure they were part of murdering tens of thousands, if not more, of Sunni Syrians during the war. And what today is that Syria is no longer a conduit for the transfer of weapons to Hezbollah from Iran. And that's very, very important, because had that not been reality, I'm not sure that Hezbollah would have been weakened enough in Lebanon to agree to be disarmed, or we would have even seen this process begin. So it's all connected, very, very important. Second thing is that now, well, Syria is looking at perhaps changing its posture towards Israel. I don't think that the word peace is anywhere in the text, but it's more of a security agreement where Israel will withdraw from certain parts of the buffer zone that Israel extended into Syrian territory out of a defensive need to make sure that there's lots of kilometers between where jihadis are and where Israeli civilians are, and lots of IDF in between, which I think was a very wise decision made by the cabinet and executed by the IDF. And we're looking to perhaps narrow that down and then to have a political agreement with the Syrian regime that creates a big no-go zone for anybody with weapons inside Syria, so that Israel won't need to be forward deployed, and also provides humanitarian relief and improved conditions for minorities in Syria. Specifically, what we care about are the Druze in Sweden and other places. I think those are the two components. Discussions are ongoing. It looks as if Israel will try to use this as somehow to compete with the very negative news cycle that we're going to be suffering from, with all these recognitions of a so-called Palestinian state by foolish Western countries that are really aiding and abetting Hamas. What Israel will try to do is to have part of the news cycle, and it will be very interesting to see which network goes which way. My guess is that recognition of this fictitious state will take more, and something tangible between two foreign enemies will get less attention, even though it's positive. But it's positive for Israel, so we shouldn't expect it to get a lot of views. But I think Israel will try to time this with within the 2 coming weeks, maybe next week, so that there will be positive traction. A word of caution, of course, we are talking about jihadists in suit. We are talking about people who grew up and their entire adult lives have been dreaming about jihad, have been exercising jihad. Jihad meaning not the religious internal, that's the jihad has two parts. One is religious and internal, like self-improvement, and the second is armed struggle against anybody who doesn't see the world like you do. So they have been jihadists all their life.
And Al-Shara fought against the Americans in Iraq.
And up until a few months ago, he had a $10 million price on his head for being a very important leader of an important terrorist organization. So everything, of course, is up for sale and dynamic, but we have to remember that these are the people that we're dealing with. Be extremely cautious and vigilant, and I think continue to signal, and this is perhaps the most important thing, continue to signal as we are signaling in Lebanon, to a certain extent in Gaza, but in Syria and Iran, in Yemen and elsewhere, that we have changed. The Israeli mindset has changed, and we are no longer going to allow the co-location of hostile enemy intentions with hostile enemy capabilities anywhere near our borders that could challenge the security of Israeli civilians. That is not going to happen. So if you have hostile intentions and you're halfway around the globe without the capacity to hurt Israelis, then maybe we won't get to you, we won't spend the time. But if you get close and you have those two, intentions and capabilities, you will be targeted by Israel, and you shouldn't be surprised. And that is what Hezbollah terrorists are seeing today in Lebanon, a continued effort by Israel to strike Hezbollah terrorists wherever they are, in the Bekaa Valley, in Beirut, in southern Lebanon. If you're busy doing things that are supposed to kill Israelis, we will target you. That's what's happening in Syria, that's what happened in Doha, and that is what Israel is busy planning to do also in Iran.
You mentioned those Western recognitions of a supposed Palestinian state. I saw a survey that came out saying 9 out of 10 Brits, for instance, are against that recognition.
Even Labour voters.
Even Labour voters, and UK pledging to do it in any case, and many other countries as well. What are the repercussions? What kind of message does this send?
I think what it does, it might as well murder Israeli hostages. I think it makes it very difficult for Israel to, through a negotiation, get hostages out, because Hamas is emboldened by it. It gets great diplomatic support because what it says in plain language is Hamas is winning. This is a strategic victory for Hamas, not for the Palestinian Authority, not for the so-called Palestinian people. This is a Hamas victory because there's a straight, direct line that goes from October 7 to this foolish recognition of a so-called Palestinian state. And it is a gold, it's the King's Road for Hamas. That is what it is. And if this war ends with an intact Hamas, what that will be is this will be the main campaign of Hamas in any future elections, whether it is in Judea and Samaria or in Gaza. And they will say, quite rightfully so, you, the Palestinian Authority, mucked around for many years and you didn't get us anywhere. We, the so-called resistance, we did jihad. We murdered Israelis in their homes. We scared the Israelis. We took them hostage. And at the end, the world provided us with the ultimate prize, and that is recognition of Palestinian statehood. Therefore, we, Hamas, are the legitimate leaders and the representatives of the Palestinian people. And anybody who thinks, whether he's in the Elysee or at Downing 10, that this will strengthen the so-called moderates of Palestinian society doesn't have a clue and doesn't understand the very basic fundamentals of Arab and Middle Eastern behavior. This will embolden Hamas or whatever abomination will come after Hamas. This is the stuff that organizations like ISIS and Hamas and Al-Qaeda, this is what they need, this is what they want, and this is handing them that victory. So it is extremely sad, and I fear that it will have real-world repercussions for Israel. I think that we may see drastic moves by Israel done in order to undermine it, drastic moves that may also be difficult and challenging for our security, but this will be kind of a spiteful response to this foolish recognition. And I see a lot of negative things coming out of it. What will prevent it eventually is battlefield victory by Israel. If Israel ends this war with a defeated Hamas, with hostages back in Israel, and with Gaza in such a state that it's clear for everybody that this is the result of when you take such horrible and atrocious action against Israel as Hamas did on October 7, maybe then Palestinians will understand that, well, no, jihad is not the way, that the way of Hamas is not the way, and that they should be looking to live in mutual respect alongside us. They should recognize that Israel is the ancient and modern homeland of the Jewish people, and they should come to terms with that reality. The moment they do, all the better for them, because then finally they could perhaps get on with building their own future, being prosperous for themselves, owning their own destiny, and actually taking charge of their own future. Currently, Palestinians, whether it's in Gaza, in Judea and Samaria, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Jordan, in Egypt, they are still being used as tools by other countries and entities who have a hostile agenda against Israel. If I were a Palestinian, my number one goal would be to abolish UNRWA and to make that as fast as possible, and to have Palestinians in charge of their own future and destiny. Stop dreaming about returning to Israel. Stop speaking about victimhood. Stop claiming that they're third or fourth or fifth generation refugees, which is, total nonsense when you think of it from a rational point of view, and say, okay, we've had a tough few decades. Let's brush it off and let's own our destiny and let's go forward. And the fact that they're not doing that, it's only to their own detriment, and I'm sad for them that they're being used and abused by so many other countries, including now by naive Western democracies who think and say, I don't know if they really think it, but let's say they say that they're trying to help the Palestinians. What they're doing is anything but.
Yeah, crazy to see the UK, France, other countries like Spain, really who have suffered from terrorism, giving that message that terrorism pays.
Yeah, former colonialism. I mean, you could see that the arrogance is still there. You could see that's British and French and Spanish, and it's interesting that these three countries, former major global colonial powers that disrupted the world, that murdered, that exploited, that enslaved millions and millions of people, and now also have the lack of strategic wisdom and the audacity to dictate to us how we should defend ourselves and how we should live. There's some interesting historical choices to make here.
Absolutely. I mentioned at the beginning of our interview that you've been giving us your insights since October the 8th. It's been a long 2 years. We certainly hope that the war will come to a satisfactory end and that the hostages will return. And you've been with us in uniform and out. Maybe I could just ask you just finally to give a message as we approach this Jewish New Year to followers of Stand With Us, Jewish and non-Jewish people of goodwill from all around the world advocating for Israel. Perhaps you can turn to this camera here and just give a message.
So I would like to bless everyone watching. And I think, as I said, when it rains on everybody, on you and on the enemy. And it is a tough time, 2 years of fighting. I know that people watching this, I'm sure, have faced adversity, wherever it is, in the UK, Australia, Canada, the US, many other places. You watching this, you identifying as pro-Israeli, you caring about Israel, you standing up for Israel, I'm sure has forced you to face adverse situations, whether it's outright violence or the fear of violence or discrimination. My message is that we are going to win. And yes, it is difficult. Yes, there are challenges. And the more news you watch, the worse I think you think the situation is. I would assure you that reality on the ground is far worse for our enemies than it appears in Israeli and international media. And I think that's a good thing. I would recommend you to minimize the consumption of media. I work in media, so I have to consume a lot, but you don't. And I would advise you to consume things that are truthful and not laced with lots of politic and spin, because it isn't useful for anybody. And at the end of the day, focus on the fundamentals. We live in our ancestral homeland. We're busy defending it. We are right in defending it, and we are going to defeat the enemies that attacked us, that took our people hostage, that want to kill all of the Jews and don't recognize our right to be here. And we will do so in a humane way that is in accordance with our values as a Jewish democracy that also respects international law. And we will do it while also constantly trying to find better ways to solve conflict that isn't just the use of force. Reaching out to people that are willing to say, okay, you know what? We accept the fact that you're here and we're going to live peacefully alongside you, respecting your borders and hoping that you will respect others. If our neighbors do that, then I think what they will find is progress, prosperity, stability, and justice for them and for us. If not, they'll meet a resolute enemy that will fight until the fighting's done, even if that will take a long time. But I hope that our enemies will be wiser, and I hope that the nations of the world will recognize that. And I hope that the sacrifices made by our brave men and women in uniform will be for a good cause. And I'd like to reach out and say, Shana Tova, keep strong, be proud, keep on fighting, and good things will follow.
An important message. May it be a happy, healthy, strong, and peaceful New Year for the State of Israel.
Amen.
Thank you so much. Shana Tova to you, Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.